Thanks very much for having me. This is really fun for me. I see a lot of old friends. What's going on in oncology? I'm going to try and look into the future, and I'm going to try and lay out what I think are possible trends to pay attention to, shifts in the landscape. I don't think there's any question that we're in a phase of what I think Harvard Business School professors would call creative destruction. That the old models, whatever they were, set up at any number of docs in the community, fee-for-service and spreads on drugs and other things like that, and adequate reimbursement being enough to sort of keep a system going, all that stuff is eroding in different ways. And what we're looking at, I think, are both opportunities for new payment models and care redesign, and also serious threats coming from a number of different places. So let me talk about what, I'm sort of an insurance guy, about risk shifting and what we're seeing and what we might see eventually. There's no question that this is risk shifting is one of the core ideas that everyone is looking at in the context of healthcare reform in general, as well as in oncology. I'm going to quickly touch on some new payment models, what to do about drugs, and this issue about price competition between care settings. And what I'd like to argue is a kind of a dismal situation turning into an opportunity. So let me walk you through all these different things. But again, this is forward-looking. I wish I had one of those disclosures like you get in a stock prospectus, that nothing I say is necessarily going to be true, and I certainly wouldn't bet the market on it. This comes from COA. This is this year's graph. They have a similar graphic last year. It has more information than the Dartmouth Atlas. And what it tells you is that, sorry, that's an inside joke. What it tells you is that irrespective of how you look at things, there is in general a trend towards a shrinking network of care in the outpatient setting in terms of community oncology. And these different dots going from the red and yellow and where clinics are closing and struggling to the blue and the purple, where there's consolidation between hospitals and affiliations and things like that, give you a sense of this consolidation. Now, in the context of risk, I just want to do a quick overview of what the language I might use and what we all sort of think about with risk, just so we sort of are on the same page. You may disagree with my terminology, but here it is. Right? This, if you will, the current state of being for most care right now is this, fee-for-service. Now, fee-for-service from an insurance contract setting is a no-risk situation. Each service is delivered, it is then paid for by the insurer. So what the movement of services, more services, fewer services, more expensive, less expensive, doesn't affect what's reimbursed. Right? Just those things move as an index. Care management fees, you're going to hear a little bit about this from a number of people, are a version of risk shifting where actually what's happened is it's not insurance risk that's moved, but the piece that might drive selective prescribing, for example, is stripped away. So although you're not telling a doc you are at risk if you spend more or less, but you're saying you are no longer incentivized in a particular direction. We're taking the profit and loss, we're putting into a separate check, and you get that. And then everything else you do will be sort of fee-for-service without profit or loss, or sort of invoice pricing or something like that. And then there's sort of integrated delivery or ACO kind of models where the population is defined, there's money in place to pay for care, and although there's not insurance risk in the sense that the institution gathers all the funds and then pays out like you do in the for hospitalizations, there is at the end a sort of accounting. And at the end of, let's say, a year for an ACO, an insurer, Medicare, something like that, might come and look at the books and say, well, given your X thousand people, we expected you to spend this much money, you spent this much less. We'll give you back some of it. That's a gain share. Or we'll give you overspent, you're going to get penalized this year. And then there's capitated risk, and that is insurance. Somebody takes it all. And that's what big insurers do, and we're increasingly seeing networks exploring that. Now, here are the limited risk models, and I'm just going to fly through these. And I took Robert Baird's slides to describe it, but I'm going to talk about Lee Newcomer's Pathways program and about the Cmmi Demo, which focus on expanding office hours and try to manage emergent problems in the office. The UHC demo has that feature that I talked about where the potential profits or losses are lumped into a payment, which is stripped away from the kind of individual units of services, particularly for drugs. So this is, again, from Robert Baird's slides. Margins from all chemotherapy and ancillary drugs stripped out, put into a separate check. Physician hospital services are included. There's this case management fee, which includes some of this profit. and this initial consultation fee, these things, the drugs, moving from one drug to another for an individual patient, don't specifically cause a profit or loss at the level of the individual patient. And then all these things are calculated from practice data. Here's the Cmmi demo that Barb McEnany is running. And this is, I trace this back largely to John Sprandio's work in the patient-centered medical home. The key idea here is that this demo starts to create practice structures that would net improve care and possibly save costs. That's, of course, what the goal is. And I think the projection here on the Medicare side is savings of about $4,000 per treated beneficiary over the episode or a period of time, which is really a serious amount of money. But the notion is hospital admissions and ER visits will be reduced, much enhanced access in normal practices. So docs are now showing up in clinic on Saturday and sitting around waiting for patients who are sick to come there so they can get access to labs, imaging, infusion in the doc office as opposed to ending up in the hospital. There's pathways in there, and this is the contract requirement in there. The physicians have to take call, admit patients either directly or to a practice-employed hospitalist. They agree to diagnostic, genetic, and therapeutic pathways. So a whole bunch of care redesign. If you imagine that the traditional setting of care was no accountability and no particular incentive or penalty for managing patients who may or may not go to the hospital. This, again, Robert Baird's slide I thought was interesting. In order to participate in this demo, they added 23 hours of clinic time per week. They added 19 positions to a pretty large practice. They implemented a prescription, separate phone line for prescriptions. This was their overhead and salaries and benefits. This was their infrastructure expense. It's not clear right now if Medicare counts these additional costs as components of the care redesign or as a set-aside for the grant. But it'll matter someday because we need to know if this will save money net-net. That means that these kinds of costs have to be included in overhead as opposed to just being a grant that's apart. My understanding right now is it's probably the latter, which is a problem. Now here's the questions. I've been pushing for some period of time, as any good health economist would, for complete bundling, complete move to episode payment, put the docs and discretionary purchasers at risk, let them decide, particularly because there's variations in cost of drugs and things like that, let them manage those things. I think the appetite for something like that is very, very slim right now, which is too bad. Maybe we'll get there, maybe we won't, and I'm going to talk about where I think we could get there. But I think we're probably looking mostly at shared savings kinds of models at the level of care management. And shared savings is, like I said, kind of like the ACO model. You can have asymmetric, so docs and practices, if they save money, they get some. But if they lose, they're not penalized, right? So asymmetric, you kind of either win or you're neutral. Or you can have symmetric. Up or down, the docs go along, right? Or the practices go along. The general thrust in oncology seems to be, this is the mantra I hear over and over again, let's get savings outside the drugs, and the statistics are clear. Right? There's a lot of money spent on hospitalizations, a lot of money spent on imaging, advanced testing, and things like that. The sort of fairly uniform theme I'm hearing both from companies that are in the space as well as from practices is like, we can reduce those things. And again, John Sprandio's work has shown that, through the patient-centered medical home, they could reduce hospitalizations by a meaningful amount. And the rumor is that that benefit has persisted but starting to plateau. So although, for example, here in the state of Maryland, we're seeing with the Blue Cross demo, year-on-year reductions from the patient-centered medical home in primary care seems to be continuing. So we don't know how long that'll compound. It seems like in oncology, at least the practices have been doing this the longest, they've kind of found a new normal, if you'll accept the term. And the general message is, like I said, practicing docs and practices can redesign care to achieve these things, reducing these sort of costs, which can either be inside the office if they own these facilities to do these services or outside, but either way, that's the theme. So what I want to think about is, what about tomorrow? And as I said, I think the general trend is to move risk, and it's to move it to the place where the discretionary decisions are made. And it's not a question of if, but when. And within if, but when, there's certainly questions of like, what does this actually look like and how granular and things like that. But anyway, there's things going on that I think are worth looking at, right? So in the community oncology setting, there's practices seeking to get to scale. so that they can start, if you will, have balance sheets that are substantial enough, have denominators of patients large enough that they can start taking on more and more risk. And they're doing this in an iterative way with payers, starting with demonstration projects, which are, if you will, smaller, with a few outcomes, but the whole idea, like regional cancer care, this is Andrew Pecora's work, and I don't know if Andrew's here today or not, but if you are, I apologize for if I butcher this, but they're nearing 100 oncologists under a single network. They're going to get to scale, and actually Andrew was saying to me recently, maybe even as recent as last week, that this is sort of the end goal, right? To get to a point where they can take the whole book of business and essentially say, we're here, give us your cancer patients, give us this fee or this fee structure, and we're going to take care of them. So they're moving towards size, but many practices are not that size. And they're also, meanwhile, in case no one noticed, garnering strong negotiating leverage with payers at the same time. So this consolidation cuts both ways, right? They're ready to take on risk, but they're also getting to a point where they could be one of the few providers in the area, which allows them to extract much higher rates. It's a good place to be, obviously, but this is, if you will, there's a yin and a yang here. AMCs in large hospitals are probably at scale already, but they don't really seem to know it. Or they're super shy, and hospitals are in general very slow to move, right, because they've got all sorts of other issues to balance. But this is the opportunity that, to me, is hiding in plain sight. So this problem is not going away. This is one of the inputs to cancer care costs. It's one I'm sort of obsessive about. But this is the month. These are all adjusted to the same year. I think it's $2,012. This is the introductory price of all new drugs coming on the market that are approved by the FDA, by the year of approval, by Medicare payment rates, standardized for the month of therapy, the first labeled indication. Here's this trend line. This is the median for the 5 years. This is the most recent approval. I think this was on Wednesday. And there it is, ibrutinib. I got a couple questions. Won't people be shocked by its price? It's an outlier. And my first response was, no, it's not. Right. So anyway, we actually got some graphical design consultants involved, and I was lamenting the problem with this, that I constantly have to move this axis. When we originally published it, we were here on the axis. That was the top of the graph. So this is now a log scale version of this, and it's much easier to see what's going on. So anyway, this is again $2,012 going from $100 to $10,000 over the period of the Medicare program. So, and this, again, apples to apples comparison. And there's ibrutinib. Meanwhile, we do have this care shift. This is from the Moran report, and I want to point out that I think this is an opportunity, not a risk factor. Right? We have this very sizable shift towards the hospital outpatient department as opposed to physician office. Community oncology has lamented this. They've done a number of reports I'm about to show you pointing this out. But I always try and look at things like, okay, if this is actually happening, where do we go from here? But this, again, the Moran report looking at the proportion of Medicare payments by chemotherapy drug codes by site of service. Very strong trend. We used to say 80% care was delivered in the community. It's now more proper probably to say it's about 60%. Why is this happening? One of the things is collapsing margins on the doc office side, right? We used to be at AWP, then we're at ASP plus 6. The sequester is at ASP plus 4.2, and efforts to get that addressed, I think, have largely failed. And the Obama budget is at ASP plus 3, by the way, for next year. Who knows presumably we won't ever pass a budget again, so that won't matter. But at least it's an interesting talking point. 340B drug discounts are on the other side of this. And remember, the 340B program only goes to hospitals. It's not for inpatient drugs, but it's for outpatient drugs in the hospital. And so only the hospitals can benefit from this through their outpatient departments. And this has caused a huge distortion in the marketplace. If you think about this going on in the doc office with margin compression, and then this going on in the hospitals where they get discounted drugs, any hospital that participates in Medicaid that have to provide these things, or any company that sells into Medicaid has to provide these. These discounts are making the hospitals completely different players than doctor offices. These calculations don't go into ASP. They're kind of outside the system. And hospitals are responding in a logical way. They are acquiring in some way or another ways to administer drugs for profit. And so they are affiliating with practices. They are buying the shells of practices and hiring the doctors. And they are also hiring doctors and purchasing their practices. So all three models achieve the same basic objective, which is to take discounted drugs and find other places they can be administered, and then garner the profits from them. And there's a variety of different models. A couple practices and hospitals have gotten into trouble for this, but on the fringes. But the basic notion is, if you're a hospital who treats the poor, then you qualify. Any patient who is yours, as defined in a fairly loose way, can get the drugs at a discount, even if they're 50 miles away from you and have never actually been in your hospital. So this is sort of what's happened with 340B. Here's the expansion. And this is the growth of 340B. It was originally, if you will, targeted at small facilities like Ryan White clinics, black lung clinics, places that really did just sort of exclusively serve the underserved. But it has been steadily expanded to the point where now we have an unbelievable number. It's about a third, I think, of U.S. hospitals, maybe more of that, are now 340B eligible. And many people will tell you this was a backdoor way of financing the ACA, because DSH payments, the payments for the care of the underserved from Medicare, were reduced in the ACA. This was a backdoor way of essentially getting the pharmaceutical industry to put that money back into hospitals that serve the poor. This is a major distortion in the marketplace and driving some of the things on the map that I showed you from COA. So where is the opportunity? Given that care is shifting to the hospitals, and given this, and I'll walk you through these data, there's this sense that, okay, care is shifting and care costs more, so what do we do about that? So there's multiple reports suggest care costs more in hospital than doctor office. This Avalier Health from 2012, which was funded by COA. This is a 2011 study funded by McKesson and USO, and this 2013 funded by Genentech. They all have this sort of similar findings, but they have different problems, and so let me walk you through them. I actually think this one is interesting. I'm going to get to it in a second. The 2011, like, as I said, was funded by the Community Oncology Alliance. Pardon me, that's funded by USO, is not helpful. It's not risk adjusted. It counts total costs. So patients who have cancer, once you have that ICD-9 code, everything is in there in the calculation. So even simple issues that anyone, sort of basic health services researchers worry about all the time, like what if patients in hospitals are sicker, is not accounted for. In fact, there's strong evidence. And why would that matter? If you're counting total costs of care, well, if the hospital has sicker patients, the total cost will be higher. That's what sickness drives expenditures, if you will. And in fact, the data is pretty clear in Millman, although it's not prominent. The hospitalization rates are substantially higher in the HOPD group, and the survival is poorer. Those are both either evidence that care sucks in hospitals, it's possible, but unlikely in a sort of national level, or those patients are just sicker. So that would explain higher spending. The Avalier report from 2012, I think, pardon me, is same exact issues. No risk adjustment, no stage, no nothing. Everything's in there. So it's not at all surprising if hospitals take care of sicker patients that you see this. But the Millman report actually looks at this. So the average costs for all allowed medical claims for these things for chemotherapy episodes were this much higher. It's the only report broken down by some details of cancer. And this one actually is giving us a roadmap to savings. So just to give you a sense, I am bashing the 2011 report, said it's not properly risk adjusted. Just to give you a sense of what I see when I read something like this, a basic question would be, fine, we can risk adjust. Let's just get down to the costs of chemo, right? So here are two facts in the report. The number of sessions of chemotherapy in the physician office versus hospital outpatient department per patient, it's 6.6 and 3.9, so more chemo visits per patient in the physician office. On page 16, 8 pages later, it lists the average cost of chemo per visit, $1,604 and $2,504. Now, if you looked at this, you'd be like, wow, the physician office is so much cheaper. If you look at this, because it's not attached to any numbers, you're like, oh, I don't really know what to do with that. Nowhere in the report does it list the total spend. And this is not a problem. I'm not saying that this makes hospitals cheaper. I'm just trying to give you a sense of how slanted the report is. If you just multiply these two things together, the truth is that the chemo spend in the hospital outpatient department is less. That doesn't mean they're cheaper. It's probably because the patients are sicker. But nevertheless, it sort of gives you a sense of that, how slanted that report is. But this one is adjusted for adjuvant or metastatic, using claims, but anyway. And it gives us a roadmap right to savings, right? Here's the episodes. And these could be better defined, But here's the spend in the physician office versus hospital outpatient department. This is from private insurance for cytotoxic chemo and for biologics. And these are huge price differences. These can be seen in these colors as well, the biologic and the green is chemo. And you can see it in the, if you will, in the adjuvant setting as well. And this is the reason for it. These are the costs of the drugs per dose per claim for these various drugs. And the reason is that we're just paying way more for these drugs in the hospital outpatient department on the private insurance side. This is 2013 based on 2009 and 2010 data. This is nothing compared to what we will see through consolidation and greater purchasing power by hospitals. So if you want to ask where is the potential for savings, where do we want to start thinking about bundles? Where are there entities that could save money by getting lump sums for all drugs they use? You go to the places where there's huge profit margins, right? So we can look in the physician office and say, okay, those margins are squeezed. People are going out of business. Fine. These hospitals have balance sheets, and they're getting fantastic reimbursement. So they're exactly the ones to target for, fine, you have all the balance sheet, you take the risk. And then these sort of fat profits, if you will, could provide opportunities. And remember, this is the payment rates. We're leaving out the fact that a lot of these hospitals are also 340B. So they're getting the drugs for 40% less than the doc offices on average. And that even they have marketing leverage, so it actually in some cases may be less. So I happen to work at a hospital. I have copies of my resume because that may end at about 4 o'clock today. But anyway, this is where it's at. And we should be looking at it. And these are serious players. So I see opportunity. So is there anything good about this site of care shift? And like I said, it's happening. I mean, I'd like to get rid of 340B. I'd like to see a change in ASP. I'd like to see all these things. But we shouldn't assume that. So is there anything good? There might be for cancer patients, right? Hospitals may be more integrated delivery networks. They aren't always. Sometimes they're kind of chaotic, right, and redundant and things like that. Hospitals can get bigger drug discounts as larger purchasers. That's a statement of fact, right? They just have more negotiating leverage. Hospitals can actually go more easily to a salary staff model at scale across disciplines. In fact, physician practices have a very difficult time going to those things that tend to be partnership arrangements. But this is, most people will tell you in healthcare, although there are no data to support it, that this model works better and conserves spending. And as I said, hospitals have larger balance sheets to take on risk. And just to give you a sense of this, even in Medicare, the 2013 Millman report is for private insurance. Here's the Medicare numbers. All right, so we ran these regimens through the physician fee schedule for, I apologize, I don't remember which year this is. Oh yeah, it's here, 2013. Standard dose, this is really an apples to apples using standard Medicare rates. There's no geographic adjustment. So this is for a place in the country that doesn't exist where there's no adjusters, all right? But at least it's fair. And you just take a regimen like this for a month, and here's Medicare's reimbursement, right? Hospital outpatient for FOLFOX versus physician office. So this is the comparison for these three different regimens. It's on average about 8 to 10% more to have the exact same service delivered in the hospital than it is in the doc office, okay? Statement of fact, a fair comparison. Now we pass through the 340B discounts, and we say, fine, Medicare now is going to pay 340B plus 4% or 6%. And we had to pull an arbitrary number, which is a 40% discount. For 340B, that's a very plausible number. It actually is kind of secret what the discounts are, but trust me, it's in the ballpark. If we just pass through those discounts and use the same Medicare reimbursement formula, all of a sudden the hospital outpatient department is about 3/4 of the cost of the physician office for this same regimen. That's not surprising. We just gave the hospitals a big drug discount. They already had it, at least the 340B ones, and we just passed those savings through to Medicare patients and the taxpayer. And so, again, opportunity, right? So if we took those 340B hospitals, passed this through, all of a sudden, this looks like a great thing for patients and leads to savings. So just sort of something to think about. Thanks very much for your attention.